Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. I hope you are all hanging in there post-election. With so much in the news, I decided to focus on movies on Netflix that I thought would be a good escape, and these are all new movies on Netflix. So I'll be talking about the movie I Am Woman, which is about the life of Helen Reddy in the first segment of the show. In the second segment, I'll be talking about the movie Fisherman's Friends. And in the third segment of the show, I'll be sharing my thoughts on the movie Holidate. And then stick around for the end of the show, when I'll be talking about Rebecca, which is a remake of the movie with the same name that is a 1940 classic. Now let's dive on in. As I mentioned, the first movie I'm going to look at today is I Am Woman. This is considered a music and musical movie, and it's based on real life. It's also a biography and drama. It was made in 2019, but it just landed on Netflix this fall. It's an hour and 56 minutes long, and it's rated TVMA, meaning it's for mature audiences. This movie was directed by Unju Moon. She's a relatively newcomer to directing, and this is her first major feature. She is an award winner. She won an award through the Athena Film Festival, and as a student, she won the Best Short Film at the Shorts International Film Festival for her movie Sorrow's Child. She is also the director of a video short called Tony Bennett and Amy Winehouse, Body and Soul, as well as a documentary called The Zen of Bennett. So it seems that movies about people who are in the music business are in her repertoire. Helen Reddy is played by Tilden Cobham Hervey. She's been nominated for a number of awards, and is a winner for Generous K+, the Best Short Film, a field guide to being a 12-year-old girl at the Berlin International Film Festival. Other movies she's been in include 52 Tuesdays, One-Eyed Girl, Girl Asleep, and Hotel Mumbai. The actor Evan Peters plays Helen Reddy's husband, Jeff Wald. He's had a good number of nominations for his appearance in American Horror Story, and he won Best Horror TV Actor for American Horror Story at the iHorror Awards. He also won Breakthrough Performance for Clipping Adam at the Phoenix Film Festival, and he won Best Actor in a Short Film for The Accomplice at the Tahoe Reno International Film Festival. Movies he's been in include The Good Doctor, Adult World, Elvis and Nixon, and The Lazarus Effect. In this movie also stars Danielle MacDonald. She is a winner at the Australians in Film Awards. She also is a winner at the Hamptons International Film Festival, and I talked a bit about her in my July 10th podcast with regard to the movie Dumplin'. Other movies she's been in include Trust Me, Lady Bird, and Falling for Figaro. She's also been in some television and had an appearance also on American Horror Story. The summary that Netflix gives of this movie is, in the 1960s, Australian singer Helen Reddy struggles with misogyny in the music business until she records an anthem to the women's movement. Those elements are definitely in the movie, but I don't feel it does this movie justice. The movie opens in New York in 1966, and we see Helen holding the hand of a young girl in the subway, who it turns out is her daughter. Next thing you know, they're in the waiting room of Mercury Records, and Helen is there because she has won a contest, and she believes that's going to lead her to be able to record an album. She came with her young daughter all the way from Australia just for this opportunity. But when she meets with an executive, she finds out that what she was led to believe was not necessarily the truth, and the opportunity falls through. So being in this strange city, not knowing anybody, not knowing whether she should leave or stay, she decides to look someone up in the phone book. It's Lillian Roxon, who is also Australian. It's unclear whether Helen had known her before, or if Helen just was aware of her name, but it was the only other Australian person it seems she was aware of in New York. And Lillian is played by Danielle MacDonald. So the two meet up, and Lillian is a big proponent of music, as well as women's rights, and she writes for publication. The two women hit it off more than they thought they would. They actually become fast friends, and Lillian becomes Helen's big cheerleader and really encourages her to stay in New York and to not leave the United States until she makes it big. Lillian introduces Helen to the New York scene. She also throws a birthday party for her, and it is there that Helen meets Jeff. Not only does it turn out that she and Jeff really have a great connection, but Jeff is also a manager with a big agency. So he's a really important connection for her. Also, Helen got a gig singing at a little nightclub, but it's not very crowded. The people there don't seem to really click with the music that she's singing. But one day Jeff comes in and sees her sing, and it just seems like there's some chemistry there and something bigger as the potential for happening. The next thing we know, she and Jeff and Tracy, her daughter, are off to Los Angeles. Jeff is pretty clear that he'll be able to make her a star in California. He wants them to get married, settle down, and watch her career take off. But once again, things don't quite go according to plan. Jeff gets a job as a manager, and Helen is no longer his priority. It seems like over and over the message is clear. It's time for the boy bands, and there's not really a market for women singers. At least that's what all of the male executives say. For a time, Helen is resigned to being a housewife and having to clean everything. She is really fed up with that. She finally takes her power into her own hands. She insists that Jeff keep making calls until he finally gets a yes, and he does. She gets a break to make a single album. She knocks it out of the park, and suddenly she's an overnight success. But the thing is, the record company wants a lot of control over what it is that she sings. And Helen is an artist, and she sings with purpose. One day she gets very inspired to write a song about women. She records it, but all of the executives at the record company are men, and they just don't believe in this song. Jeff helps develop a compromise for how to get the song out there, and it becomes Helen's signature song, I Am Woman. Much of the rest of the movie outlines Helen's relationship with Jeff as it changes, because Jeff begins getting involved with drugs. It's about how she can maintain her success. Will people believe in her music because it's so different from what the boy bands are doing? It focuses on her success because she starts becoming a very wealthy woman, but that can start reflecting on Jeff and his manliness, and this gets under his skin a bit. The movie also continues to explore her relationship with Lillian and that friendship and how things change as she becomes more successful, and as Lillian, though she has her own successes, has a life that continues to be full of struggle in New York. And it's also about how Helen tries to maintain her own artistic vision and what she has to do in order to get there. I felt that this movie was quite solid. The story flowed, the specific scenes that were chosen to show Helen Reddy's life seemed poignant. In particular, I felt scenes were chosen well that demonstrated how a woman was trying to fit into a patriarchal world within the music industry. She bumped up against a lot of barriers, and were it not for Jeff, it's hard to know if she would have reached the level of success that she did. Something that I did find interesting in this movie is that Helen seemed to be kind of a goody two-shoes in a way. She was clean, she ate well, she took good care of herself, she was grounded. She seemed like an all-around together person. It was hard to see if she had any particular flaws. So I felt she was painted in a way that made her out to be a little too flawless. We didn't really get to see much of her human side. She seemed to be pretty even-keeled, and it was the things around her that kind of went a little crazy, including Jeff when he was on drugs. The longer he was on drugs, the more volatile he became. Despite that, and I gather that was mostly how the script was written for Helen, I liked the acting quite a bit, especially in the first third of the movie. This is mostly where we see the characters meet each other and build chemistry. I really liked how Helen and Lillian hit it off. Lillian was quite forward-thinking, and Helen had already demonstrated herself to be someone who wasn't willing to play victim. And the combination of the two really showed off that these were women who were kind of before their time. But I would say it's more so Lillian who had an influence over Helen. There was a really lovely scene where Lillian and Helen and Tracy were hanging out together, and Helen just wasn't cutting it financially at the little nightclub where she was working as a singer. And she was also doubting whether she was really being a good mother to Tracy. Helen talked about how she had been raised by parents who were also performers, and she was used to being on the road. But she didn't know if that was the kind of mother she wanted to be for Tracy, or if that was even good for Tracy. Lillian, who deeply believed in women's rights, made it clear to Helen that if she went back to Australia, she probably would never make it back to New York. And also, by pursuing her dreams, she was teaching Tracy that it was okay for her to pursue her dreams. It was really a lovely scene, and it set a foundation for these two young women to be deeply connected throughout the rest of the movie. Early on, there was also the scene where Helen got to meet Jeff at this party. In their introductions, Helen easily outdid Jeff in terms of a challenge about how successful each of them was planning to be. Jeff really admired Helen's attitude, and she really appreciated how he seemed to appreciate and see her. I could feel their chemistry from the very start. Other powerful scenes to look for are when Helen wants I Am Woman to be the top song on her album, and the executives at the record company have no faith that the song will sell. Jeff, as a manager, knew how to play the game, but Helen didn't know that Jeff needed to play that game. And so she mistook his going along with what the men wanted for him giving in to their needs. Something that did frequently seem to push Helen's buttons was when Jeff seemed to meet everyone else's needs before Helen's. And in that vein, there is also another excellent scene. This is when Helen has been fed up with being a housewife, and she wants her career as a singer and artist. She and Jeff clash quite a bit about this, but this is where she insists that he not give up. She actually practically holds him hostage in a room till he keeps calling over and over and over the same executive until he finally says yes. I say this is one of the more humorous scenes in the movie, and it really speaks to a side of Helen that shows her persistence and her inability to accept no for an answer. It seems to fit the saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and it made for a really great scene. It's definitely one to look for. In many biopics, especially those that have to do with the lives of musicians, it seems that drugs come into the picture. In this movie, I think there was an interesting twist, because it was Helen's husband, Jeff Wald, who had a drug addiction. So drugs certainly affected Helen's life, but as it turns out, what we see more is her response to her husband's drug addiction. She herself did not have that problem. But because of Jeff's drug addiction, he lost track of things, he spent money like crazy, and this essentially ended up ruining so much of Helen's life. She was broke, had to pay bills, was behind on so many expenses. Because Jeff was her manager, she just expected that he was handling the business of their family. But his addiction really got in the way, at least according to the movie. It wasn't long after Helen discovered the impact of Jeff's drug addiction on her and her family that she seemed to take a break from singing. And I think this is when the most human part of Helen showed itself. She kind of went into hiding. It's like she was so embarrassed by what had happened that she just didn't really want to sing a whole lot anymore. She did go through a phase where she went back to her more jazz roots for a while, but ultimately, when Jeff was not really in her life anymore, she just hung it up. It wasn't until a big movement was happening around women's liberation that she finally was coaxed to come back out into the world and sing her trademark song. I didn't know a lot about Helen Reddy before this movie. I knew her songs, I knew who she was, but what this movie really taught me was how she was a very strong woman and how she really became a voice for women to help encourage them and help them see how strong they really were. Up until the time that she sang her songs, it seemed there wasn't really a lot out there to encourage women and inspire them. And it seemed that one of the inspirations for her was her daughter Tracy. She wanted to make sure that Tracy was raised knowing that she could be a powerful person. And for sure it seemed like her friend Lillian was a big influence on her. When there are biopics, I also like to see how much the actor is able to embody who the original person was that they're playing. I felt Tilda Cobham-Hervey did a really great job. I felt that her body type looked very 70s. She did a good job with makeup. At the same time, with her facial expressions, I felt in a way she was maybe a little too feminine to play the role. I didn't think of Helen Reddy in real life as being someone who was pretty. She was somehow very practical. And I do think that practicality came across, but it was something that was part of her essence, and I'm not sure that succeeded. Also, there were a lot of songs sung in this movie, and I believe that Tilda Cobham-Hervey was probably lip-syncing. There were a couple of times where I felt she was a little bit off, but overall she did an excellent job. And I thought she must have been lip-syncing because Helen Reddy has such a unique voice that I think it would be hard for anyone to really be able to capture the way that she actually sounded. And I felt Evan Peters did a great job as Jeff Wold. He had the biggest emotional ups and downs, and I think Evan just knocked it out of the park in terms of having the extreme emotions. I checked out the trivia section on the Internet Movie Database about this movie, and there were two things that stood out to me that I thought I'd share. One was that Tilda Cobham-Hervey was actually named by Entertainment Weekly magazine as a breakout star from this movie, and that was at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2019. That was specifically for her role in this movie. And the other thing is, and it's quite sad, but Helen Reddy passed away in September. Actually, just a few weeks ago, September 29th. And it was only a month after the movie had come out in both Australia and the United States. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a most excellent movie, I would give this one an 8. It could potentially be a 9. I felt that it was all really well done. I felt that it was almost more a bit on the level of a really excellent TV movie than a real full-blown theater movie. And it's simply for that reason that I feel it deserves more an 8. But I do recommend it. It's a really good watch, and I learned things. Stay tuned for the next segment of the show when I'll be looking at the movie Fisherman's Friends after the break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Thanks for joining the second segment of the show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the last segment, I talked about the movie I Am Woman. I'm now going to discuss the movie Fisherman's Friends. This movie is considered a comedy drama and it's family-oriented. I saw it on Netflix, and it is rated PG-13. There is some language and light sexual content. It was released in 2019, but it's new on Netflix. It's an hour and 52 minutes long, and it's focused a good deal on music. One other point is that this movie is actually based on a true story. This movie was directed by Chris Foggin, and he is an award-winning director. He won an Audience Recognition Award at the Aspen Shorts Fest for Friend Request Pending. And he also won the Festival Award at the New York City Short Film Festival for Best Comedy, also for Friend Request Pending. With that, he has, it looks like, mostly directed short films. He has also directed the feature film Kids in Love, and Fisherman's Friends was just his second feature. He's gone on to direct some episodes of a TV series called Cold Feet, and he has several other feature films in the works. This movie stars James Purefoy, and he won Best Actor for the movie Photo Finish at the Temecula Valley International Film Festival. And while it looks like most of his experience acting has been focused on television, he has been in a good number of films as well, including Mansfield Park, A Knight's Tale, Vanity Fair, John Carter, and Churchill. This movie stars Daniel Mays. He won Best Actor for Rehab at the Reims International Television Days. And while he's also been in quite a bit of television, his movies include Vera Drake, The Secret Life of Words, and Atonement. And this movie stars Tuppence Middleton. Her movies include The Love Punch, A Long Way Down, The Imitation Game, and Downton Abbey. James Purefoy plays a fisherman named Jim. Jim seems to be kind of the leader of all the fishermen. He's the father of Alwyn, and she is the love interest of Danny. Alwyn is played by Tuppence Middleton, and Danny is played by Daniel Mays. This movie starts out with some scenes in two places. The first place is in Cornwall, and it takes place in 2010. And the second place is in London. Cornwall is where there are a group of fishermen. Most of them seem to be related. They go out in their fishing boat and they sing sea shanties. In London, by contrast, we see a group of recording executives. They all seem to be friends and get along quite well. They joke around with each other, and in particular, Danny seems to be the butt of their jokes. Now, Danny has been a very successful executive. He's won awards for the albums that he's produced, and at the same time, he seems to be a bit of an odd bird. The guys love him, but it's clear that they make jokes at his expense. So, as would be expected, these two worlds are going to collide. It turns out one of these music executives is engaged to a woman who's from Cornwall. So these guys decide they're going together to do a kind of bachelor party. They're planning to go yachting, and it was a little unclear, but I think it was just 1 week before the wedding was to take place. And the wedding was to happen in the Cornwall area. So we see the setup that there's already 2 occasions where these guys are going to be in this part of England. Now, Cornwall is about 4 hours from London, and it's right on the ocean. It's not so much a touristy town. It's really just like a small village, and everybody in that little village seems to know each other. This music executive is planning to marry a woman who is in the Montague family. The Montagues are a wealthy family that have a large home in this part of England, and this is where the guys are going to stay during their visit. When they visit, the people in the village kind of frown upon it. They find that the people from London coming to visit tend to look down on them, don't show respect. They think that this is just a quaint little place and the people are very innocent and they don't really know what life is all about. But the fact is, the people in Cornwall, their history goes way back. Their stories have passed down through the generations, and that history really helps feed their purpose. They also have had tough lives, especially the fishermen, all the time as they risk their lives going out on the sea to catch fish. They deal with the elements, they have to have their wits about them, they're smart businessmen. They have a lot going for them and a lot to celebrate. And they don't like being underestimated by the city guys who come and have these posh jobs and enjoy their materialistic things. So when the city folk come to the village, well, these villagers are not very open to them and they are not super friendly. It takes a lot for them to trust outsiders. Plus, they're very set in their ways. They know what their purpose is. And there's a lot of love to go around for all the people who know each other in the village. The first encounter these guys have are with Alwyn. As I mentioned, Alwyn is Jim's grown daughter, and she has a young daughter named Tamsin. Alwyn needs to get Tamsin to school, and she's driving her through the little alleyways, and then she almost comes head-to-head in a collision with the rich car that these city guys are in. Right away, she puts them in her place and says they have to back up. But they have a larger car, and they're a little nervous to back it up and scrape it up. It's definitely a polished car, and it looks like it was worth a good amount of money. So the guys are reluctant to back up. They don't want to risk hurting the car. So Danny hops out on the urging of the other guys, and he tries to make peace with Alwyn and convince her to back up. She has less to back up than they do. Well, she rails into him and explains that this is a one-way street and they're the ones who've made the mistake. She's in a rush. So the guys give in and they do back up. I felt this scene was pretty symbolic of how things are going to play out in the rest of the movie. There's a lot of the city folk pushing for what they want and the villagers easily pushing back in a fight to get what they need. Now, it does seem that the villagers do have a good point. In the next few scenes, we get a taste of how the city folk really do in this small village community. Well, the guys had planned to celebrate the bachelorhood of the colleague who's getting married with a yacht ride. It turns out something happened with the yacht, and that part of the celebration is canceled, so they need to come up with Plan B. They decide to try their hand at paddleboarding, and it is a disaster, to say the least, and they need rescuing. And while the guys in the village are fishermen, it's probably not a surprise that they'd also be the ones to rescue people who are having trouble out at sea. There's also a scene where these music executives go into a bar, and they make fun of the name of one of the kinds of beer that's available, and the woman who's the bartender, she's an older woman. In fact, she's Jim's mother. Well, she has the best comeback. I'm not going to give it away, but it's definitely something to look for. It gave me a good laugh. So we see this tension between how the city folk are and how these village folk are. And this conflict bears out in the rest of the movie. The fishermen, on a Friday at the end of their day, decide to do something that they often do on a Friday, which is sing their sea shanties to the public. The music executives take a listen, and one of them thinks that these guys would be great. They should be on an album, and it should be up to Danny to sign them. Danny thinks that this is not a very good idea. He doesn't see how producing these sea shanties are going to make any money for the company or himself. But they convince him that he needs to do this, and they also set up an ultimatum. They say he should not return to the office until he has made this deal. But what the audience knows that he doesn't is that they are not being on the up and up about this, and it puts Danny in a very difficult position. He has followed through on the wish of his partners, and he has talked to the fishermen and convinced them that, yes, they will indeed go ahead as long as he keeps his word. As it turns out, Danny has also taken a liking to Alwyn, so he has an added reason to stay. But also, as he gets to know the guys and hear their music, he really starts believing in it. He starts insisting to his partners that he needs to move forward with this deal, and they push back and say that he needs to drop it. This conflict pushes Danny to make a decision. Where is his loyalty? Is it back with his associates who have pushed him to do something that is a very uncomfortable thing? Or is it with these people in the village who seem to have a way of life that is so different from what he had in London? They're real and straightforward. They don't care about money and materialistic things. It's the relationships that are most important to them. Relationships, their family, and history. So Danny does push forward with recording the fishermen singing their songs. And then the next weekend is his pal's wedding. There have been some last-minute hiccups with the photographer at the wedding as well as the music guests. And so Danny has Alwyn help out with photography because he's seen her photos and knows she'll do a bang-up job. And he invites the fishermen to sing at the wedding. There are going to be a lot of music executives at the wedding, and this will be a great way to preview them. But once again, we get to see what the priorities are. As it turns out, the fishermen who are on the rescue team need to go out and help somebody who's having an issue at sea. So not the complete group can make it to the wedding to sing. Without those key singers, things are not quite going according to plan for any of them. And then this once again puts Danny in a difficult position in terms of loyalty. From here on in, there are lots of complications. There's a question about whether the album of these fishermen is really going to be created, and can Danny sustain being a part of this new village community? All of these come into question, and it creates a delightful story of lots of personalities and twists and turns in the story. I won't give away what happened, but I will say, at the very least, that overall this is a light movie. It has heart, and despite the struggles, things end on a comedic note. So in these times of turmoil, this was a really fun movie to watch. It's full of practical jokes that end up with results that you would never expect. One thing that's particularly comedic is that Danny really sleeps soundly. He sleeps through alarms, and it takes a lot to wake him up. At one point during his visit, he ends up staying in the bed and breakfast that is run by Alwyn, and is also in the house where Jim and Tamsin live. When Danny is there, he set his alarm because he wants to get up super early to be able to go out with the fishermen on their boat. The alarm goes off, but it just keeps ringing and ringing because he is not being awoken by it. And I won't say what happens, but Alwyn does something that is pretty funny to get him up. There's also definitely a love story here, and it is mostly between Danny and Alwyn. Alwyn is not about to let anyone from the city get away with much, and when she continually puts Danny in his place, it actually helps him gain more and more respect for her. and for a guy who liked to play the field quite a bit, this is definitely something new. I tend to really like movies where there is somebody from one culture being immersed in another culture, and that is definitely the case with this movie. And so personally, I'm partial to it. So if you like those kinds of movies, likely this one will be one that you'll enjoy watching as well. And I noticed when I looked this movie up on the Internet Movie Database, I saw Fisherman's Friends 2 is planned to come out in 2021. It's hard to know if it'll be on schedule considering the pandemic, but it is something at the very least to look forward to. Now, one theme in this movie has to do with whether or not the sea shanties can actually hold their own with an audience. Can an album of these songs earn any money? Well, clearly an album was made, and there was enough success that they wanted to make a movie out of what transpired to make that happen. But just a heads up, I am still singing the songs in my head since seeing the movie. They're catchy, and in some ways they remind me of songs that I learned in grammar school, and I actually really like them. Now, unlike with I Am Woman, which I reviewed just prior to reviewing this movie, I felt that there was lip syncing in that movie, and this one, if there was, I didn't pick up on it. Now, there were times where I thought maybe the recording of these songs happened outside of the filming of this movie, just to make the sound quality better. But at the very least, I did believe that these actors were singing themselves. At the end of the movie, they do show photos of the original Fisherman Friends group. I liked being able to picture them, and I didn't feel that the actors actually looked a whole lot like them, but I didn't feel that it was necessary either. Overall, I felt the acting was good in this movie. I was actually pretty impressed with the young girl who played Tamsin. Her name is Meadow Nobrega. She had a good number of lines, and there was definitely an emotional quality that needed to come through. As a young girl, on a number of different levels, she needed to experience loss and show that, and I felt she did that. I also felt that the casting was good, that the actors all looked well matched. And this movie had quite a bit of conflict, as I mentioned, so the actors really did get into it, and it was pretty convincing. I think there was a chance that this movie could have gotten pretty cartoonish in its comedy, but the acting did seem quite real. In this movie, it felt more like this was like a light drama where there are comedic moments that happen versus this was a comedy where there are airs put on in terms of the things that were happening to the characters. One thing that I thought was funny, but I don't feel came across quite effectively, was the scene where Danny was finally recording the fishermen singing their songs. The fishermen were reluctant to record the songs in the first place, so they had their demands, and one of which was they didn't want to record in a studio in London. So they set up in the outdoors where they're used to singing, and Danny was recording it, but then a flock of seagulls came and were making a lot of noise behind them. Alwyn then suggested, well, why don't they go to the church where there's really great acoustics? So they did, and this I didn't feel really held up. In the church, the sound is very echoey, and while that can be beautiful in a church service when there's a chorus, for recording an album, I didn't feel the acoustics actually were very good. I felt the echoes were very distracting, and this happens in movies sometimes, where the writer has an idea, and they put it into the script, but the reality doesn't necessarily pan out. It really requires doing some homework. You want to be able to take the characters at their word. But in this case, I didn't, and that was a flaw to me. I would also say this movie did have a formulaic feel to it. It had a lot of the typical obstacles when it came to the love story. But because we're not used to seeing such close relationships in a community like this, and especially at a time now when we're in a pandemic and we're all so isolated, it added a unique element. That and the music, these were interesting twists, as well as this practical joke idea that I mentioned earlier. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being most excellent movie, I'd rate this one a 7. It's a fun watch, it could be a good date movie, it is not high art, but it is good for a few chuckles. Now stay tuned for the next segment of the show, when I'll be looking at the movie Holidate after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome to the third segment of the show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the last segment, I talked about the movie Fisherman's Friends. I'm now going to discuss the movie Holidate. Last weekend, this was number 1 in the US for a streaming movie. It's a comedy and it's a romance, and it is on Netflix. This is a new movie. It just came out this year. It is rated TVMA, as there's some smoking and language. It's an hour and 44 minutes long. The director is John Whitesell. He shares a Daytime Emmy Award with a group for Outstanding Direction for a Drama Series for The Guiding Light. The majority of the work he has directed is on television. He's directed episodes of the TV shows Coach, Roseanne, Law and Order, The John Larroquette Show, Hot in Cleveland, and Girl Meets World. This movie stars Emma Roberts. She's won Best Supporting Actress for I Am Michael at the Film Out San Diego US Awards. She won Choice Movie Actress for a Comedy for We're the Millers at the Teen Choice Awards. And she's won Best Performance in a Feature Film Supporting Young Actress for Aquamarine at the Young Artist Awards. Other movies she's been in include Nancy Drew, Memoirs of a Teenage Amnesiac, Empire State, and Billionaire Boys Club. And this movie stars Luke Bracey. He's been in such movies as The November Man, Me, Him, Her, Point Break, and Hacksaw Ridge. And this movie stars Kristen Chenoweth. She won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series for Pushing Daisies. She also won Outstanding Supporting Actress Performance in a Film for Bewitched at the First Americans in the Arts Awards. And she won a Gold Derby TV Award for Comedy Guest Actress on Glee. And she also won Gold Derby TV Award for Comedy Supporting Actress for Pushing Daisies, and those are all for the Gold Derby Awards. Other movies she's been in include Stranger Than Fiction, Running with Scissors, Hit and Run, The Boy Next Door, and The Witches. Emma Roberts plays our protagonist, Sloane, and Luke Bracey plays her love interest, Jackson. At the start of this movie, Sloane stands outside in the cold on the front porch of her family's home. It is decorated to the hilt with holiday lights and Santas, and she is smoking. Reluctantly, and with a kind of pessimistic attitude, she goes inside, and she's confronted by her dysfunctional family. Her mom is controlling, her aunt has no boundaries, her sister is crazed, being mother to 4 children, and she has a younger brother who has brought his girlfriend. Meanwhile, everyone is harping on her. Why doesn't she have a date? Why is she still single? Why didn't she dress up? She really doesn't need to eat at the small kids' table. She can join the grown-ups' table. She tries to downplay the fact that she doesn't have a boyfriend by claiming that she's perfectly happy being single. Next, the movie whisks us off to another person's home. Carly is bringing Jackson to her home. They probably started dating, but she is going to introduce him to her parents anyway. And this is happening just on the other side of Chicago from where Sloane's family is. At Carly's home, everything is very cartoonish. The parents are wearing crazy Christmas sweaters. They welcome him as if he's already their son-in-law. And Carly's mother is constantly revealing things about Carly that are way too intimate for this initial meeting. This over-the-top behavior is pretty funny, though honestly, a lot of it just creeped me out and I felt was done in poor taste. After these 2 difficult holiday events, Sloane and Jackson end up being in the same return line at a clothing store. They both struggle with returning their clothes and getting paid back for them in the way that they want. And with that, there's a connection. When they leave the store, they continue to have conversation, talking about their best Christmases and the fact that New Year's is coming up. Sloane floats the concept that her aunt gave her, which is of having a holidate, which means just having a date for the holidays. Not someone that you're attached to at all, but someone that you can at least show up with and not appear single. Jackson loves this idea. He likes the idea of having someone to go with and not be tied down. He gives her his number and tells her to text him. She really is not into this idea at all. But circumstances come up, and she does end up meeting up with him to go to a New Year's ball. That ball in and of itself is an adventure for them. They get to know each other better. They don't feel they have to hold anything back because they're not trying to impress each other. They have fun. They're willing to take risks. They dance like fiends. But not everything goes perfectly. And that's enough for Sloane to not want to be a holidate over Valentine's, which is the next holiday coming up. She figures by then she'll probably have someone in her life. But things don't quite turn out how she plans. And she is in a candy shop, loading up on chocolates that she'll eat by herself. She runs into an old boyfriend and his new girlfriend, and she's really thrown off by this. But luckily, Jackson happens to be in the mall and spots her in the store, and he comes to her rescue. And from this point on, she agrees that they can continue to be each other's holidate. The question is, will they ever get vulnerable enough with each other that they can actually form a relationship? While this holidate thing is happening, Sloane's mother tries to set her up with a very successful doctor. And this seems to muck with the idea of whether Sloane is really single or not. Meanwhile, Sloane's younger brother gets engaged, which is to her deep humiliation because she's still single and she's older than him. And it turns out that her younger brother, unbeknownst to her, was taking golf lessons from Jackson. Jackson is a golf pro. So as Sloane and Jackson continue to go through the holidays together, well, Labor Day weekend is the weekend of the big wedding. So while it is indeed a holiday, it is also an opportunity for the two of them to go to her brother's wedding. And it's not clear what is intended by showing up there together. Are they there really on a date, or is this a holidate? This confusion leads to a lot of ludicrous behavior. And because things were not clear, the two decided that they were going to bring a different date to the wedding. And yet they're both there. So you wonder whether or not they're going to end up together there or not. You'll need to see the movie to see what happens, but I will say after the wedding, they are back to doing the holidate thing together. Over time, they seem to be getting more serious. On Halloween, a lot of strange things happen that leads to them spending the night together. Yet miscommunication or lack of communication leads them to not really knowing where they stand with each other, and they're both angry thinking the other one needed to share some information about how they felt, and neither of them ended up really talking. Both are offended, and they essentially cool it with the holidating. So the audience is then left to wonder, will they ever come back together, or won't they? Much of this is following a lot of the typical rom-com formula. Do they both like each other? Will they both admit that they like each other? Will one of them be alienated for a time? If so, will they come back? Will one of them get over themselves so that they can actually say their truth? All of that is in this movie, and there are a lot of interesting, adventurous ups and downs. In that regard, the journey is kind of a fun one. There's a lot of unexpected things that happen. And I would say that the way into this story with the holidate concept, it is not a typical love story in that regard. But the story is pretty shallow. I felt a lot of things were done that were in very poor taste. There's a lot of talk about sex as if it's a throwaway. It is not talked about in a way that it is special, that it should be reserved for a special person. It felt to me like the whole idea of a sexual relationship was presented in a way that was disrespectful. Because of this, there are a lot of lines alluding to a sexual relationship, but the lines are really throwaway lines. They're raunchy and crude. These jokes didn't feel like there was any true humor in them. It felt like they were there just for shock value. They might make you laugh, but it's more out of a kind of embarrassment than humor, and it's not going to result in a real release that comes with great laughter. I noted down a bunch of examples, but I don't even want to record them on my podcast. The closest thing I could find that seemed kind of okay to talk about was that it looked like at Halloween, Sloane had accidentally taken some laxatives. It seems she thought they may have been candy. Jackson is bringing her home, and suddenly her stomach is acting up. And part of the issue is that she's wearing a costume that is extremely tight. While in the elevator going up to her apartment, she asks Jackson to loosen up her dress. She's really scared that she's going to lose it. And I think you get the picture. The situation was crazy. The acting was over the top. Their expressions were really funny to look at. But of all the choices that were made to create a scene that was going to have these two come together in difficult circumstances, upon seeing what was happening, I just kept thinking, oh, please. As an actor and writer myself, I just felt embarrassed by this. I believe there was really a missed opportunity here to get some genuine humor happening. Now, granted, some people like raunchy, and there are times that I will feel that it's pretty funny, but in this movie, it felt like it was just a gimmick. It was just filling space. I would have appreciated it more if it was something that came up in a conversation later on, and that somehow it really brought them closer together. And I guess you could argue in a way that did happen a bit after this incident, but even that didn't really make sense to me. Here she was feeling so sick, and then they start getting romantically involved now, on this particular day. Was she really up for it? It seems to me she just needed to rest. And I know this is a comedy and that a lot can be far-fetched, but so much of it was just not believable to me. For example, the doctor that Sloane's mother was setting her up with, he kept appearing. He kept being in certain situations by coincidence. It just happened a few too many times in order for it to be considered realistic. There's also this whole theme about how Sloane's mother doesn't really like Jackson. There's a point where they even all meet up for a meal together, and they both treat each other horribly. And yet, later, it seems like Sloane's mother has a 180. And yet this happens when Jackson hadn't done anything to deserve a change in her opinion. And I also didn't buy why these two were not being upfront and honest with each other about how they felt about each other. It just didn't seem like there was anything really at stake for them, personally or externally. I'd say the only kind of redeeming thing is the fact that these two do go through a lot, through these different holidates, and they learn that they can put up with each other. And because during these holidates they choose to keep a distance and not have anything at stake, they are honest with each other in a certain way, not in an intimate feeling way, but in just about life things. They can argue about sports teams. They don't have to act like they're trying to please each other or make the best impression. But that's the stuff that keeps this very shallow, and there's not a lot of meaning that comes out of this relationship. It felt to me that their inability to really be honest with each other, it got dragged out much longer than was necessary. Now, meanwhile, in general, I'd say the acting was pretty good. Considering the script they had to deal with, I felt they pulled it off. I felt that the actors had good connection. They had to have had a lot of trust in each other in order to deal with really raunchy topics. And in terms of energy, I felt that this was cast pretty well. It did seem to me that Jackson was a little bit older and not quite the same age range as Sloane, and that didn't really come up as an issue. It's not like he was that much older, but it seemed that he got the part more probably because of his looks than because of age. But in any case, they did get to do characters where they had moments of being way over the top, and that can be really fun as an actor to play. I also appreciated the fact that the movie started at Christmas time and it ends at Christmas time. So we get a full year of holidays and things kind of come around full circle. In that way, the story wrapped up nicely. And it ended on a really ludicrous note too, which is not a surprise and was appropriate for what happened in the rest of the movie. I do keep thinking though that the holiday concept is a really fun one, and it could have been done so much more tastefully. I was wondering what motivated the actors to take these roles. These are good actors, and this is not good comedy. I didn't feel it was even a very good script. In terms of the story itself, There were a good number of coincidences that I didn't buy. It felt like the actors couldn't trust the script just to be funny on its own, that they could have played it straight, and that would have actually made it funnier, I think. As much as I disliked this movie, I was able to sit through it, and I was open to seeing how these characters were going to evolve and how the story was going to unfold. So it wasn't torture. I've seen other movies where it really was torture. I just didn't want to watch the rest of it. I was okay with sticking with the story. I was just thinking, this is a good cast, and I felt like this was a throwaway movie for them. This is not a role they're going to look back on and be super proud of. And the moment where it's kind of a culmination, where the two do finally spend the night together, and there is a little bit more emotional intimacy, it seems so different from the rest of the movie that I was kind of scratching my head. So with that, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most excellent movie, I would give this one a 4. I do think had the script been different and had the directing been different, this could have been a much more successful movie. I just believe that movies are an opportunity for a large group of people to share an experience, that they should be a good use of people's time and energy, and that you should be able to walk away having learned something. In this case, I think the lesson that was learned is simply to be straightforward from the beginning. But this just doesn't feel like it's a very deep lesson or that a whole movie needed to be spent on providing that information. Someone else may have thought this movie was a riot and really raved about it, but coming from me and based on what my values are and what I like to see in a movie, this was far from it. Now stay tuned for the final segment of the show when I'll be sharing my thoughts on Rebecca after the break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome to the last segment of the show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the prior segment, I talked about the movie Holidate. I'm now going to discuss the movie Rebecca. This movie is the remake of the 1940 classic by Alfred Hitchcock. It's based on the novel of the same name by Daphne du Maurier. It just came out in late October. It's considered a drama, mystery, and romance. It's 2 hours and 1 minute long, and it's rated PG-13. This movie was directed by the award-winning director Ben Wheatley. He has won Best Film for Down Terrace at the Austin Fantastic Fest. He won the Thriller Prize Special Mention for the Thriller Competition for Free Fire at the Brussels International Festival of Fantasy Film. He also won the Peter Sellers Award for Comedy for Sightseers at the Evening Standard British Film Awards. And he also won Most Promising Newcomer at those same awards. And those movies have also won other awards as well as nominations. He's actually directed a bunch of episodes for different television series. Among his feature films are Kill List, High Rise, and Happy New Year, Colin Burstead. The actress Lily James plays Mrs. De Winter. She is also an award winner, having shared the Best Performance Award for Little Woods at the Gasparilla International Film Festival, the Breakthrough Award at the Harper's Bazaar Women of the Year Awards, and she shares the Ensemble Award for the Outstanding Performance by an Ensemble in a Drama Series for Downton Abbey through the Screen Actors Guild Awards. Other movies she's been in include Wrath of the Titans, Fast Girls, Burnt, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, Darkest Hour, All About Eve, and Yesterday. And actor Armie Hammer plays Mr. De Winter in this movie. He and the cast of The Social Network have won a good number of ensemble awards, probably most notably at the Hollywood Film Awards. He was also nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Performance by an actor in a supporting role in a motion picture for Call Me By Your Name. Among the movies he's been in include J. Edgar, Mirror Mirror, Nocturnal Animals, Sorry to Bother You, and On the Basis of Sex. And this movie stars Kristen Scott Thomas as Mrs. Danvers. She was nominated for Best Actress in a Leading Role for The English Patient at the Academy Awards. She won Best Actress in a Supporting Role at the BAFTA Awards for Four Weddings and a Funeral. She shares the Best Ensemble Cast for Gosford Park through a number of different awards. And over the years, she's won a good number of awards through the Evening Standard British Film Awards, including Best Actress for The Party, Partir, Angels and Insects, Four Weddings and a Funeral, and she also won Most Promising Newcomer for A Handful of Dust. She also won an award for Best Actress in a Comedy Series for Fleabag through the Online Film and Television Association. She's won a good number of other awards and nominations. Some of her other movies include Bitter Moon, Angels and Insects, Mission Impossible, The Horse Whisperer, I've Loved You So Long, and Darkest Hour. There's a lot to say about this movie because it is the remake of a Hitchcock classic. I think it's very brave of Ben Wheatley as director to take this on. He has solid directing experience, but compared to some other directors, not a lot. And when remaking a movie, any movie, let alone a classic, you run the risk of always having your movie compared to the original. And the original starred Sir Laurence Olivier as Max de Winter, and Joan Fontaine as Mrs. de Winter, and Judith Anderson as Mrs. Danvers. Sir Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine had followings for years. They're pretty much household names, and they gave memorable performances in this movie. So I am both going to look at this movie, how it stands on its own, as well as how it does indeed compare to the classic. There are some differences between the two. And the opening is a voiceover of a young woman talking about how she dreams of Manderley, which right away gets the audience's attention. What is Manderley, and what is she talking about? So that hooks us to want to find out what the rest of the story is going to be. Then we get the flashback to why she was recounting that dream at all. There is a young woman who is in Monte Carlo for this summer. She's working for an older woman as her companion. She gets back from doing some shopping for the woman she's working for, and we see right away that she's a little klutzy and not super attentive. Now, the woman she works for is Mrs. Van Hopper, and this woman really seems to have it in for making this young girl who's working for her feel as small as she possibly can. It seems Mrs. Van Hopper has a complex in terms of showing her power, and by taking it out on how this young woman is working for her seems to help boost her own ego. That's my read on it anyway. Mrs. Hopper is sort of a nosy woman. She doesn't keep any boundaries. She's insistent and intrusive. She's not a very savory character. And when she finds out that Mr. De Winter is staying at the same resort that she is staying at while in Monte Carlo, she insists that they spend time together. This is not what Mr. De Winter wants, and he really sets a strong boundary. But when Mrs. Van Hopper is out of the picture, he shows that he's genuinely interested in the young woman who's working for her. Now, this young woman is not within his status. Mr. De Winter is very wealthy, very well known, and most would say that he is way out of this young woman's league. But circumstances are such that De Winter and this young woman end up spending quite a bit of time together, and they grow very attached. De Winter shows that he's somewhat moody, he is a widower, and any time his wife is mentioned, he really gets in a foul mood. Often he'll just storm off, wanting to brood on his own. It's very easy for the young woman as well as the audience to believe that he is just still in mourning, and that it's very painful to talk about his wife. But when Mrs. Van Hopper gets some news that she needs to travel to the United States, and she's going to have the young woman go with her, and it's going to be quite spontaneous, the young woman tells De Winter this information, and he proposes to her on the spot. This is quite a shock to Mrs. Van Hopper. And of course, she believes both that the young woman manipulated De Winter and that she's not worthy of De Winter. and she completely believes that the young woman's marriage to De Winter is going to be an utter disaster. With that, we then get to see what happens next with the young woman in marriage to De Winter. Is what Mrs. Van Hopper said going to bear truth? After a quick ceremony, De Winter and his new wife go back to Manderley. She is completely blown away by the size of Manderley. It is an enormous home, an enormous property, and a lot to take care of. It is well beyond her personal experience to have the level of responsibility needed to manage all of that. But there's going to be some help. Mrs. Danvers has been the housekeeper of Manderley for some time, and she has a whole staff under her who help make the place run. As the new Mrs. De Winter tries to settle in, get to know the lay of the land, understand her role, we have a sense that Danvers, who always has an eerie sense about her, has the intention of undermining the new Mrs. De Winter. So once again, a seed is planted to have the audience stay invested in the story. Mrs. Danvers is such an interesting character, and she seems underhanded, so we want to find out, what is she actually going to do? Is she how she seems on the outside, or is there something more to her on the inside? As time goes on, Mrs. Danvers continually drops hints to the new Mrs. De Winter about what the old Mrs. De Winter, whose name was Rebecca, was like. The new, young, insecure Mrs. De Winter ends up having somewhat of an inferiority complex based on what she's hearing, because Rebecca had a reputation of being quite a beauty and somewhat renowned in the land. The new Mrs. De Winter just doesn't know how she can compete, even with just the memory of the old Mrs. De Winter. So what happens is, the new Mrs. De Winter has a story in her mind of how her husband must have loved Rebecca. And she continues in her own mind to believe that she should be able to match the image of Rebecca. But she doesn't know a lot about Rebecca, so it's kind of a guessing game. And also because her husband won't be forthright in talking about his former wife, that his new wife is constantly walking on eggshells. She never knows what she's going to say that's going to set him off, and he does get set off. He gets a temper, he walks away, he can act out, and she doesn't really understand why. He doesn't explain anything to her. So it's all left up to her imagination and to what Mrs. Danvers tells her. This creates a pretty unhealthy situation. Towards the end, we find out that Rebecca died of unusual circumstances. It appears that her husband may have been involved with her death, and it looks like Mr. De Winter and his new wife and their marriage is probably not going to hold together. If there's any chance that it will, it means that the new Mrs. De Winter needs to grow up fast. We find her taking risks in order to find out a truth, and that's a truth that is going to prove her husband is innocent. On the chance that you don't know the story or have never seen the former movie, I'm not going to give away what happens at the end, but it would say for each of the characters, we get to know them quite well. We get to find out what they're really made of. We get to see what occasion they're willing to rise to under the stakes that are so high for each of them. And there are a lot of twists and turns that keep us very involved. I felt the acting was good. I did feel that both Armie Hammer and Lily James were well cast. I loved Kristen Scott Thomas as Mrs. Danvers. I felt of all the characters, she was the most well-developed, the most layered, the person that I was most curious about. I felt she did give a standout performance. And I think that's also interesting because in the original movie from 1940, I felt it was Sir Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine who gave the standout performances. To review this new version of Rebecca, I did watch the 1940 version. It had been some time ago since I saw it, so I wanted to be sure it was fresh in my memory. If you're interested in seeing it as well, you can see it for free at archive.org, just doing a search for it under the movie section. In the first part of the movie, which is set down in Monte Carlo, there were definitely some differences in the story. It seems to me in this newer version, there were choices that were made specifically to further dramatize what was going on. The way Mr. De Winter and his future wife meet is different in the newer movie. Much more is made out of the love affair that she's having with Mr. De Winter. And Mrs. Van Hopper is much more over the top in the current movie. Also in the new movie, the future Mrs. De Winter needs to be a little more underhanded and dishonest around how she's spending her time with Mr. De Winter. She doesn't want to reveal it to Mrs. Van Hopper, and she's trickier about it than the future Mrs. De Winter in the older version. I would say in the older version also, I felt the love between Mr. and Mrs. De Winter felt much more palpable. And something that I found very interesting was the fact that we know what we know about women's role in society today. It seems that was a bit more respected in the newer version of the movie. In the older version, Mr. De Winter used to say things that were really down-putting in a way to the new Mrs. De Winter. He used to call her a child. When he proposes to her, he says, "I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool." There are these kinds of backhanded remarks like that throughout the movie. In the newer version, there is also that kind of status difference that's made clear, but it's done a little bit more respectfully, or at the very least, maybe a little bit more playfully, so it doesn't come across necessarily as kind of a put-down. I'd also say, in comparing the two movies, the new one more consistently throughout uses more dramatic effect. I felt that the script was written in a way so that the dialogue was crisper, that there was more of a relationship that happened between the characters. It felt less stilted, and at the same time, it felt darker to me. It seemed to me that as Mr. and Mrs. De Winter learned more about each other, because they'd really only known each other for about a week or so when they're in Monte Carlo. So it's very much like two strangers suddenly in it for life together. So they really don't know each other well, and as time goes on, it feels like the shadow sides of them come out much more. And while that made it more interesting in a way, I found for me that the characters just weren't quite as likable. They were edgier and, in a way, sort of more modern hip. Now, I don't want to give away the end, but we do see Mrs. De Winter transform, I think, quite a bit more in the newer version. We see her driving a car by herself. We see her trying to outsmart other people. But also in doing so, she's truly proving the depth of her love for her husband. When it comes to the Mrs. Danvers characters, while I love Kristen Scott Thomas as Mrs. Danvers, and I think she does provide a very interesting, layered approach to who she is, she seems to have both a deep well of sadness as well as a hardened, weathered exterior. But she seemed that way pretty consistently throughout the movie. In the case of the older movie, I felt that the first Mrs. Danvers, she seemed a bit oblivious to how she was behaving and how she was affecting the new Mrs. De Winter. It seemed she would say some things that could really throw the new Mrs. De Winter off and that overwhelmed her. And it was more through the movie that we got to see that more hardened, saddened, kind of crazy character start to come out and show herself more. And I kind of liked that a little bit more. I think it keeps the mystery of her going a greater distance. And when in the story we come to the point of questioning how Rebecca actually died, I have to say I had a lot more sympathy for the old Mr. De Winter in the 1940s version of the movie than I did in the current movie. I definitely think that the new movie can stand on its own, and if you haven't seen the older version, just as well. But I think the older version, partially because it's in black and white, partially because it's Hitchcock, and it has these renowned actors, there is a mystique about it. I know just for me, watching a classic movie, I have a sense of just quality that's going to come out of it. Even though there is some dated music in it, it definitely has a 1940s feel. I think personally, I prefer the original version better. But also, I don't think it's necessary to compare them. They can be separate works of art. And the newer version still has a strong story. I think that there were interesting choices made that create the story so it can be more compelling, more like a thriller, and I think it is indeed a good watch. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most excellent movie, I would rate Rebecca, the new version, an 8. I appreciate that there are accents included around how women are today in the world, and I also just felt that the characters were fun to watch. It's definitely a character-driven story, and I do feel the actors did a good job, so I do recommend it. It's a good one to watch. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the movies I Am Woman, which I rated an 8, Fisherman's Friends, which I rated a 7, Holidate, which I rated a 4, and Rebecca, which I rated an 8. Here's to these movies offering you some inspiration. This is your host, Elizabeth Aaron, signing out. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.